Over the last couple of weeks, I had opportunity to hear again about some stories which I knew in the past, but I came back and I think and hope they will help us today in our expression of the gospel and preparing us to head towards and be nourished by the Eucharistic table. And maybe some of you, the older folks, might remember the politician or one who worked in politics, Lee Atwater. That name sound familiar? Okay. Well, I'd like to bring his story up, and also I saw recently the documentary on Christopher Reeve, somebody who had a big impact on my childhood and Superman. Both had experiences that changed their lives. Lee Atwater at the peak of his career, as he was engaged, as he said, in negative politics, he discovered he had a brain tumor, and at that moment realized that some changes were in order. In fact, he didn't really have any real relationship with God, and so things changed as he began to approach this terminal illness in his life to a way that he began to focus on things that he had let slip, his relationships with his family primarily, reconciling with some of the people he felt he hurt throughout the course of his career, and changed his attitude, he said. Christopher Reeve, we know, had a tragic accident. Here's this person who epitomized strength and chiseled, good looks, had everything, it seemed. And yet, obviously, this tragic accident where he was mostly paralyzed, maybe from the neck down. And it said in the documentary, I don't want to give it away, but that it moved him in such a way to recommit to the life that he had, supported by the love of his family, and during that time got closer to his children, who he had kind of a distant but somewhat relationship with. And they talked about that after his passing, saying that while they would never have wished that he would have had that injury, they were really moved by his desire to be spending time with them and sharing with them in ways that he didn't before that time. So I just point those two examples out as how life happens and how our whole orientation towards life can change in an instant, and how that's really what I sense our gospel might be inviting us to reflect upon as what are our values, and how do we continue to espouse the image, as we heard about in that second reading, the image of Christ that we received at our baptism, in a world that will often look at the lives that we need to lead because of that, seeing that we're somehow odd and different than the values that the world espouses for the most part, as we hear about in today's gospel and as we've heard about recently in the Beatitudes. Perhaps we can just think, well, these things are nice to think about, and yet what I'd like to suggest to you, that the reason that we gather and honor the Sabbath is to give us that opportunity to dwell on things like we heard about in the responsorial psalm, and take time, not necessarily just to be free of activities or to be passive, but to see how Jesus invites us by honoring the Sabbath as a way to grow in compassion and to build spirit, so that I'd like to suggest that God rested on the seventh day. It wasn't rest as we think from exhausted behavior, because God didn't need to rest in that way, but to help us to see what real rest is, and see how that calls us to build our souls in union with God, and how God wants to nourish us for that and help us to honor the image of Christ that is ours at our baptism. And I'd like to just read to you from one of my favorite spiritual writers. Maybe some of you have heard of her, Carol Houselander. She's got a fantastic book called The Passion of the Infant Christ, very kind of odd title, but a mystic who lived in the kind of in between the world wars, World War I and II in England, and died in the mid-50s. And she says this about rest. Rest, far from being relaxation, is a culmination, a fullness, of gathered peace, like the fullness and stillness of waters gathered to a flood tide. Think of a child asleep in his mother's arms. The abandon with which he gives himself to sleep can only be because he has complete trust in the arms that hold him. He is not lying asleep on that heart because he is worn out with anxiety. He is asleep there because it is a delight to him to be asleep there. The mother rests too. She rests in his rest. Her mind and her body rest in him. His head fits into the crook of her curved arm. Their warmth is mingled like the warmth of two softly burning flames. She rocks to and fro, and her rocking is unconsciously timed by his breathing. Rest is a communion of love between them. It is a culmination of content. On the child's part, utter trust in his mother. On the mother's part, sheer joy in the power of her love to sustain his life. Such as this was the rest of God in the beginning of time when he had created the world. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. So just an image of how, potentially, the Sabbath could be approached not just as the end or the beginning of the new week, energizing ourselves, but how we work towards it. That's what we work hard for, so that we can take that opportunity for the opportunity to build and cooperate with God in the building of our souls. And that's why it's important for us to have Sabbath rest, not just because we're exhausted or filled with anxiety, even though we might be, but we have this opportunity to build our souls so that we could grow in having these values. They don't just come overnight. Loving our enemies, that's not very easy. And yet I call to mind Martin Luther King Jr., who in his writings said his real goal was to have a double victory. He wasn't interested in only having rights or conquering hatred and racism, but helping convert those who were enacting it. That was his true goal, is to help them to see the insanity of the way they were living their life. It wasn't good for their souls. It wasn't good for their bodies. It wasn't good for anybody. And to help them see, some who even called themselves Christian, the craziness of treating another person in that way. And so his goal was this double victory, he said. And as you pass out the shrine driveway there, I don't know if you have a chance, don't always look behind you, but on the back of the shrine to St. Maximilian Kolbe, do you know what it says? Anybody?
Hatred destroys, only love creates.
Hatred destroys, love alone creates. Go and spend a little time with that on a Sunday. Or the responsorial psalm, and see how God might be inviting us to see how we're called to these values, not because they always make sense, but because we're called to that double victory as followers of Jesus. That's what he did. He always approached those who were challenging him or perhaps even going to cause his death because he loved them. He wanted to convert their hearts. So I sense that that's the attitude that our scriptures that seem kind of strange to us and maybe to the world, like we're somehow going to just let people walk all over us. No. We're taking the true power that Jesus offers us because our concern is their conversion. That hatred is a sign of sickness, evil. And that's where we have to head, according to Jesus, to love, to help them because they're on the wrong path. So this is a challenging gospel, clearly, one that I don't want to make to see, okay, that everything's going to change this way tomorrow. But I think by gathering on the Sabbath as the fullness of content of allowing God to work in us to help build our spirits, that we can begin to act in a way that sometimes questions the spiral of violence in our world, helps us to step out of it, to question it, and point towards the cross of Jesus Christ, saying that that's the answer. That's how and what we're doing. And we want to be agents and examples and physical expressions of compassion. That's our call, and I think the call of this gospel. And so I hope that this might help us to see the seriousness and not to put a lot of pressure on us, but to see if we could be like this child that Carol Houselander talks about, and to see that that's really what the Sabbath is about, us resting in the crook of God's arm, allowing that rocking to beat heartbeats together, and finding some ways to allow that to build our spirits so that we can stand up and challenge the insanity that sometimes is the experience of many in our world. We have to point it out because they need our help. They can't survive, and I think that's God's call to us, to keep pointing that direction, to saying, this is the path. Please do your best to now change your ways, convert your heart, turn from any hatred that's destructive to the love which alone creates.